Hi everyone. Again, thank you for inviting me today and for everyone who's being here today. I am going to be sharing with you a study that we conducted examining the impact of co-speech gesture on children's analogical reasoning ability and visual attention. So very much in line with a lot of what Matthew was explaining about my interests and experience. So to start with a brief definition, I know most of you know what analogical reasoning is, but I like to sort of give a working definition for how I'm conceptualizing it. So for this talk, analogical reasoning is the ability to identify any kind of underlying schematic or relational structure shared between separate experiences or across contexts. As an example, a scene analogy task like this one might ask someone to find an item in the picture on the right that is in the same part of the pattern or corresponds relationally to a circled item in the picture on the left. Here, if this tiger is highlighted in the picture on the left, the correct relational choice would be the lion in the picture on the right because they're both chasing in their respective scenes. So they correspond analogically or relationally. Therefore, here chasing is that common relational structure. In its mature form, as we know, analogical reasoning contributes to a host of skills that are necessary for a children's future academic, later career success, and so on. It contributes to things like innovation, inductive reasoning, creativity, and the list goes on. And these are all skills that require identifying relational similarities shared between contexts in order to make a conclusion about the context as a whole. And so promoting analogical reasoning in the classroom has been shown to support learning in a variety of instructional domains from mathematics, science, history, and more. However, developing successful use of analogical reasoning is not easy. Young children struggle with solving these kinds of problems. And this ability is characterized by a protracted development, with early stages of this ability evident in very early childhood from 3, 4, 5 years old and reaching something that mirrors adult-like ability in early adolescence. So one root cause of children's struggles with tasks of analogy is said to stem, at least in part, from insufficient inhibitory control or underdeveloped inhibitory control. That is, children have a tendency to, and there's plenty of work that has found that children struggle to visually attend to the important parts of an analogy. That is, children have a tendency to focus on featural similarities that are shared across contexts. So while children as young as 3 and 4 can solve this kind of problem fairly well, this task becomes significantly more difficult when there are superficially similar items present in the problem. So for example, if we add a featural lure to this scene analogy, such as another tiger in the picture on the right, young children are going to struggle to identify that relational structure of the problem that is chasing, and more often than not, will choose that featural match rather than any kind of analogical match. And children not only choose that featural match more often, they also visually attend to those matches more readily than to relational information or relational matches. Furthermore, recent work has begun to establish relationships between all these factors: visual attention, inhibitory control, and analogical reasoning. In recent work, in collaboration with my PhD advisor, Liz Wakefield, but also the lovely Bob Morrison and Lindsay Richland, I conducted a study aimed to better understand the role of inhibitory control and visual attention in young children's analogical reasoning. So this was part of a larger study, but essentially we monitored 4 to 5-year-old children's visual attention while solving the same kind of scene analogies I just showed you, and in a variety of different relation types. So like chasing and reading beyond just the chasing. And we asked them to essentially, these young children, to find and identify which thing in the picture with the blue edges is in the same part of the pattern as the circled thing in the picture with the green edges. And importantly, we also collected a measure of inhibitory control. So with this work, we were able to demonstrate relationships and relations between these 3 factors. So briefly, we found that we were able to demonstrate that children's visual attention patterns are related to their analogical reasoning ability. That's not a novel finding, but we do build off of that, such that where children orient their attention directly, where they orient their attention directly relates to their accuracy or choice of the featural match. So for example, looking to the featural distractor, the more children look to that featural distractor, that featural match, the more likely they are to choose that distractor. We also found a main effect of inhibitory control, suggesting that children with lower inhibitory control are more likely to choose the featural match as well. And in contrast, looking to the distractor is negatively predicting accuracy as well, which I'll get into in a moment. And last, we also established a direct association between children's inhibitory control and visual attention patterns, such that the higher children's inhibitory control, the more likely they are to orient their attention towards, the higher children's inhibitory control, the more likely they are to orient their attention away from those featural matches. So this association between all of these factors, children's visual attention and performance, inhibitory control and performance, and inhibitory control and visual attention. So even though most would agree that this is an important ability for analogical reasoning is an important ability for learning in the classroom, and while the field has now has a better understanding of the mechanisms driving both children's difficulties with reasoning analogically and the development of this ability, research addressing classroom tools to support this ability is still limited. That is, how can we use all of this information in the field or to design or identify an effective instructional tool for analogical reasoning? An effective instructional tool for supporting this ability, sort of in one brief sort of statement, should help children focus on relational similarities during comparisons and avoid the lure of these featural responses. And there are two key ways that I think this could be achieved. One of those being driving attention away from irrelevant components of a comparison and towards relationally similar components. Given that previous work does demonstrate connections between all of these factors, so inhibitory control and visual attention and analogical reasoning performance, but then also between visual attention and analogical reasoning ability, for children with lower inhibitory control, showing them where to look should help them focus less on featural distractors, which in turn has been found to support better analogical reasoning performance. The other way this could be achieved is by facilitating comprehension of spoken instruction or speech, or ambiguous speech. So in the case of analogical reasoning, instruction may be complex and ambiguous, as it often is. It may be unclear which piece of an analogical comparison, whether it's a scene analogy I just showed you or another comparison, which piece is being referenced in speech at any given moment, which items are relevant or irrelevant for solving that problem. All of that's fairly ambiguous typically. Fortunately, there's a readily accessible tool that is naturally used in the classroom by teachers that may be nicely suited to serve these functions and facilitate alignment. And here I'm suggesting that is co-speech gesture. A quick definition of what I mean by co-speech gesture for anyone who's sort of unfamiliar with this idea or thinking about gestures in this way. Gestures are meaningful movements of the hands that can represent information on their own or in addition to speech. So here are just a couple examples of common gesture types. For example, some gestures roles are to reinforce any kind of accompanying speech, such as a hand gesture like the one on the left that could accompany a verbal description of sort of weighing the pros and cons of something. And this gesture would likely be reinforcing what you're saying in speech. It probably wouldn't stand on its own. Of course, there are also gestures that can simply just direct attention with or without speech, so pointing gestures, where you can point to a part of the problem as you're discussing it, if you're a teacher, to clarify your speech, or for directional purposes. And of course, there are many, many other forms of gesture that we won't get into today. These are just a few examples. And when these gestures are accompanied by speech, they are referred to as co-speech hand gestures. And these will be the kind of gesture I'm referring to today. So here we're asking, in this study, we're asking if co-speech gesture could be a useful instructional tool for supporting children's analogical reasoning. The features of gesture that make it a potentially effective teaching tool the features of gesture that make it an effective teaching tool in other domains suggest that it has the potential to also facilitate analogical reasoning ability. Specifically, if we think about the two functions of an instructional tool for analogical reasoning, those two functions that I suggested, that being directing attention and facilitating comprehension, gesture has been shown to increase children's ability to learn from instruction by directing attention to spoken reference and facilitating the link between words and what they map onto in the physical environment. And this has been demonstrated in a variety of domains from mathematics, language learning, Piagetian conservation, and the list goes on. And there's also plenty of evidence that gestures are beneficial for children's language comprehension. So for example, using a mathematical equivalence paradigm, previous work has shown that gesture instruction can help children synchronize their visual attention with spoken instruction to help them identify which side of an equation is being spoken about at any given point. So in the case of analogical reasoning, gesture may also be able to disambiguate spoken instruction by highlighting which components of a comparison are relationally important and which are irrelevant to solving the analogy. Therefore, in the case of analogical reasoning, gestures should also be able to facilitate effective visual attention patterns and, during problems of analogy, as well as be able to clearly indicate or disambiguate which items a teacher is referring to when they're providing spoken instruction, so that children are going to focus on items and relations relevant to solving the problem at hand. So to flesh that out a little bit, so take, for example, the previous example of a scene analogy I showed previously. A teacher is likely to align the important relations through their speech. So stating that the tiger is chasing the woman and the lion is chasing the horse. And this type of statement should orient children's attention to the items involved in the relation of chasing and facilitate that analogical comparison. However, when a featural match is present, the spoken instruction by itself is going to probably leave some ambiguity in terms of which tiger is being discussed. So children may focus their attention on one or both tigers and miss those important connections that are being drawn between the relations in the two different scenes. And children, and as reviewed a moment ago, we know from eye tracking studies, previous work, that children who incorrectly solve these kinds of analogical reasoning problems tend to focus their visual attention on the featural match and ignore that relational information on their own. Therefore, instruction that incorporates gestures should help children, may help young children understand which tiger is relevant to the task and direct their attention away from those irrelevant featural matches. But a question remains, will gesture instruction provide the same boost to all children who struggle to solve analogical reasoning problems? And while the general consensus is that gesture supports learning across other domains, there are nuances to the effects that should be considered in the case of analogical reasoning. So previous work has found that in other domains, from math, word learning, and so on, children's pre-existing knowledge related to the domain in question, or what I'll refer to as their cognitive profile, can impact whether they learn from gesture instruction. So for example, in the domains of phonological ability or mathematics, as a few examples, having rudimentary or foundational skills or understanding within that domain is necessary in order to benefit from gesture. So you need some kind of foundational knowledge from whatever sort of source in order to benefit from that gesture instruction that's being provided. So as an example, Wakefield and James found that only children with high phonological ability benefited from speech plus gesture instruction when they were taught the concept of a palindrome. So we need that foundational knowledge in place, or cognitive profile, as I'll refer to it many times. So that is, while gesture may serve as an effective instructional tool for analogical reasoning, its impact may depend on children's current cognitive state or this cognitive profile relevant to analogical reasoning ability. And children's analogical reasoning improves over time due to many different factors, but in large part to increases in executive functions like inhibitory control and working memory, where increases in these executive functions are positively correlated with improvements in analogical reasoning. So for young children, their ability to process multiple relations simultaneously, so say those two scenes, is limited by their working memory capacity. Similarly, their ability to inhibit that salient featural match response is limited by their inhibitory control. And due to the protracted development of these cognitive abilities and these executive functions, analogical reasoning similarly develops gradually over time, with maturation continuing into adolescence as children's cognitive profiles develop. So taking all of this previous work into consideration, there are three primary goals of this study. We're splitting it into three questions here. So first we're asking, do children benefit differently from that speech alone instruction versus speech plus gesture instruction? And I'll explain the differences there in a moment, on analogical reasoning based on their age. Here, we're going to be treating children's age as a proxy for their cognitive profile or current cognitive profile. Given that previous work has established all these different relations between these relevant cognitive abilities, inhibitory control, working memory, related to age as children develop. And then of course, age has been related to analogical reasoning performance as well. So in other words, we're asking whether the impact of gesture instruction varies depending on children's age and therefore their cognitive profile. Next, we're asking, can we find evidence that gesture instruction helps disambiguate spoken instruction? And again, does this depend on age? And finally, do looking patterns associated with the type of instruction that children receive, does that impact whether children at different ages learn from instruction? Where we're aiming to further understand how gesture impacts children's analogical reasoning by asking whether the impact of gesture instruction on analogical reasoning and visual attention, if that depends on their age, cognitive profile. It may be the case that gesture does not support all children's understanding of spoken instruction to the same extent. There may be sort of a sweet spot, right, where children have enough foundational cognitive abilities related to analogical reasoning that they can sort of use gesture to clarify that spoken instruction and boost their learning. Whereas children above or below that sweet spot, this developmental point may not show an advantage when they're learning from gesture. And so the results of this study add to our general understanding of the mechanisms by which children learn, especially analogical reasoning, and explore the utility of this type of instruction, gesture, in a domain that's important for academic success and has been understudied in the gesture for learning literature, that being analogical reasoning. So in the study, we compared how children across a fairly wide age range, 4 to 11 years old, solve seam analogy problems before and after instruction, so that being speech alone or speech-plus gesture instruction, while we were monitoring their visual attention using eye tracking glasses. Using a wide age range allows us to understand how cognitive profile contributes to the effectiveness of this instruction, and then using eye tracking allows us to understand how gesture may aid in the disambiguation of instruction. Behavioral measures were collected at pre and post instruction, and eye tracking measures were collected throughout the task. And data was collected at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, Illinois. At pre and post instruction, we asked children to solve scene analogies like this one, like you've seen previously now, using the prompt, the same prompt as I described earlier, where each trial included a pair of scenes presented simultaneously, and importantly, the scene from which they had to choose that answer had that featural match. So something superficially similar to the circled prompted item, but not involved in that relation of interest or chasing here. So in this case, that would be the dog in the picture on the right, and then the correct choice would be the mouse. So instructions were provided live by the experimenter. Scenes were accompanied by spoken instruction highlighting the commonalities or the relations between the two scenes that were shown. I'm going to show you an example of a speech plus gesture trial, just to give you a sense of what all is included in that. While watching it, keep in mind that for speech alone, there just wouldn't be that gesture component, but it would be the same verbal information. And if you can't hear it, someone let me know and I can narrate it for you.
Look at these two pictures. I will show you the pattern. See, the boy is chasing the girl, and the dog is chasing the cat. This means the boy is in the same part of the pattern as the dog because they are both chasing, and the girl is in the same part of the pattern as the cat because they are both being chased.
Great. So just like I said, all of that same verbal information would be provided for a speech alone trial, just without that gesture component. So our eye tracking analyses, we focused on a few different measures. At pre and post instruction, we focus on proportion of time spent looking to two different areas of interest, two items within the scenes, that being that featural match and the correct choice. So, and then at training, we assess visual attention in a couple different ways, in two different ways. First, because previous work suggests that gesture helps children follow along with verbal instruction and synchronize their visual attention to that visual, the physical stimuli. We assessed children's ability to follow along with our instruction, and that serves as an index of whether they looked at the relevant reference of the problem as they're being spoken about. So training videos were divided into smaller time increments or live experiment that corresponds to portions of the verbal instruction. So we split each sort of training trial into 4 segments, and children received a score of 1 or 0, depending on whether they followed successfully. So take the first segment here. So when the instructor would say the boy is chasing the girl, in this example, if the participant, the child, looks to the boy and then the girl when those items are being referenced in the verbal information, they'd receive a score of 1, a successful score of 1 for that segment. Because the videos were divided into 4 time increments, following scores range from 0 to 4 in terms of success. With the second measure of visual attention during training being what we call a featural match check-in. And these are instances when children fixate on that featural match rather than the featurally similar item that is actually in the relation of chasing. So here that would be the 2 boys. So it's a check-in of whether they are looking to that featural match boy instead of the other boy. And these can occur during the time segments when the featurally similar item in the relation is being spoken about. So again, that's only 2 of the 4 segments. And this measure tells us whether or not gesture is helping to disambiguate which featurally similar item is actually relationally important. Before addressing our main question of interest, we wanted to establish that age could serve as a proxy for cognitive profile. And I'm very sorry if you can hear some crazy dogs in the background. That's just life these days. Again, we reasoned that because previous work has shown that as children's inhibitory control and working memory improve, they're likely to succeed on analogical reasoning problems. And now we know that children with lower inhibitory control look more to the featural match when solving these problems. Therefore, finding that age is predictive of performance and visual attention measures would suggest that age can serve as this proxy of cognitive profile for us. So to do this, we asked whether children's ability to solve analogical reasoning problems could be predicted by age and visual attention before instruction, so at pre-instruction. As with previous studies, we found a main effect of age, where older children are more likely to solve these problems correctly than younger children. And in terms of visual attention, we assessed whether children's proportion looking to that featural match before instruction predicted their performance. And as this is sort of because looking to this featural match is a key looking pattern associated with making these errors. So that's why we focus on featural match looking. And we found a relation between visual attention patterns and performance. So looking to that featural match was negatively related to accuracy and positively related to featural errors, which all makes sense and sort of reinforces previous ideas, but it's nice to sort of replicate that. So together, these results and the results of previous research provide support for us considering age as this proxy for cognitive profile. And that says the same thing. So when assessing the impact of instruction at training and post-instruction, we actually limited our analyses to children who incorrectly answered that pre-instruction trial, so we could get a really clear measure of learning from this subset of children. First, we asked whether the impact of gesture instruction on children's analogical reasoning, if that's dependent on their cognitive profile or age. Overall, more children in the speech plus gesture condition correctly answered the post-instruction trial than children who were in that speech alone condition. But we can see that performance is dependent on age. So where older children are performing better after instruction than younger children. However, this should be considered within the context of a marginal interaction we found between age and condition. So post-hoc analyses indicate that actually only 5-year-old children are demonstrating this benefit of speech plus gesture compared to speech alone at that post-instruction trial. Whereas for all other children, there was not an effective condition by that point. Next, we asked how condition and age influence children's visual attention during instruction. So while they were watching that live experimenter sharing the instruction. And we considered, again, following ability and these featural match check-in scores. In terms of following, we can see that on average, children followed along more successfully with spoken instruction if they were taught through that speech plus gesture, suggesting that gesture is a cue that can organize visual attention regardless of children's age. In terms of check-ins, gesture instruction also seems to facilitate fewer check-ins with that featural match. However, the amount of difference between our two conditions seems to differ by age. So post-hoc analyses indicate that whereas older children seem to make use of both types of instruction to avoid that featural match, for younger children, say 7 years and younger mostly, their visual attention is oriented away from that featural match more effectively by that speech plus gesture than speech alone. Where the added supportive gesture seems to help them disambiguate the spoken instruction and direct attention away from those matches. So having established that gesture does impact visual attention during instruction, and we can ask whether these visual attention patterns explain our post-instruction behavioral results to see how this visual attention during instruction actually relates to later performance. And we find that following score, so their ability to follow with that spoken instruction during training, is not predictive of their accuracy at post-instruction, suggesting that even though gesture helps children follow along with that spoken instruction at that moment, this does not contribute to learning effects in the case of scene analogies. To understand the relation between checking in with the featural match during instruction and performance, we took into account our findings that in general, instruction affects the degree to which young children and not older children check in with that featural match. If you think back to the last slide. And we find that while older children's check-ins with the featural match did not predict their post-test, post-instruction accuracy, for younger children it does. So check-ins were negatively related with their success on that final problem. And this suggests that gesture's ability to direct attention away from the featural match and disambiguate the meaning of their speech is the critical factor in impacting analogical understanding for these younger children. So to summarize, the goals of the present study were to explore whether the impact of adding gesture to this instruction on analogical reasoning, if that depends on children's cognitive profile, and then to further sort of flesh things out and use eye tracking to understand how gesture might facilitate learning by disambiguating this instruction and how that might impact children's analogical reasoning after that instruction is no longer present. So to address that first question, our results suggest that yes, cognitive profile does seem to make a difference in children's learning. Specifically, gesture's ability to disambiguate speech and direct attention seems to be particularly useful for these 5-year-olds. They may be at this sort of pivotal, this sweet spot in terms of development that I mentioned before. While they may have limited cognitive profile and immature analogical reasoning, their inhibitory control and working memory capacity are developed to the point that they can utilize that added support gesture provides. So that cognitive profile is to some degree in place for them to benefit from gesture. And this actually does corroborate previous work in the gesture for learning literature, where children need some prior knowledge in the domain to make the most of gesture instruction. Whereas for all other children, those younger and older than 5 years old, there was not that significant benefit that we saw with the 5-year-olds. Where the youngest children, those 4-year-old children, may not have that sufficient cognitive profile in place to benefit. That is, while gesture supports effective visual attention for those children during instruction, their inhibitory control and working memory may be too underdeveloped to extend that understanding beyond instruction, beyond the moment that instruction is provided. Whereas for older children, they may have the cognitive profile in place to actually make use of both types of instruction to guide their visual attention, and in some cases impact learning after instruction. That is, even though they struggled prior to instruction like everyone else did, their more developed inhibitory control and working memory allowed them to learn from that speech alone instruction as well. And the addition of gesture wasn't really critical for them, wasn't necessary for them. In regards to our second question as to whether gesture helps disambiguate spoken instruction, gesture does seem to help all children follow along with spoken instruction, but it only seems to direct those younger children's attention away from that featural match, which is sort of that kind of key critical issue that is sort of a hindrance on their ability for analogical reasoning. And finally, we asked, do looking patterns at instruction relate to children's analogical reasoning ability at post-instruction? In short, yes. So while following did not predict performance, fewer check-ins at instruction did predict younger children's later success at post-instruction. So quickly, I'd love to mention as the last little bit here, a few directions for future work that sort of future directions that kind of build off of these findings. So for example, similar work could and should try to consider even younger children. So the children in this study likely all had an underdeveloped, yet probably present, relevant cognitive profile to support these rudimentary sort of stages of analogical reasoning. But to more fully understand the impact of gesture on children with little to no relevant cognitive skills, we could extend this and adapt this task to incorporate, say, 2 or 3-year-olds as well. Given that some suggest that children younger than the age range we used here, so 4 years old, have these rudimentary sort of capabilities at hand. Additionally, the impact of gesture may not only be nuanced in terms of children's cognitive profile, but there are many other contextual and situational factors that have been cited as playing a role in its effect on learning. So as an example, some research has found that the advantage of speech plus gesture is not even always evident at immediate post-test measures, but rather at follow-up, later on follow-up measures from 24 to 4 weeks later. So sometimes that, that effect can sort of come out over time. And in sum, the results of the present study extend our understanding of how we can support analogical reasoning during development and how this gesture instruction impacts learning in the domain of analogical reasoning. And these findings have important implications for designing teaching methods to support analogical reasoning, but also just using gesture as a tool more broadly. Because analogical reasoning shows this protracted development due to the slowly developing cognitive profile, it seems that at only certain points is gesture really helping children beyond speech alone instruction. And then of course, recognizing this tool, recognizing when this tool can be used could lead to faster growth in a skill that is at the root of so many different cognitive skills, innovation, creativity, and the list goes on. And then just some thank yous to my advisors, collaborators, all the RAs that helped with this data collection because it was a big sample collected at a museum, coding, and then parents and children in the museum itself. And I'd love to hear any questions you have. I couldn't tell if the chat was going off the whole time or not, so I'm sorry if I missed something along the way, but I'd love to answer your question if it refers to something earlier on as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katharine. Another lovely talk and interesting work. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to virtually raise your hand and you can ask them yourself. I know Karen's put one in the chat box. I can read that out, Karen, or if you'd like to ask it yourself, just jump ahead and do so. I'll ask it for you. Okay. So it says, have these visual attention tasks been used in children under 4 years of age at all to assess whether they are looking during, to assess where they are looking during analogical reasoning, perhaps in a simpler task?
Yeah, sorry, so I couldn't unmute. I was trying. Thank you for reading my question.
Was that anything to add? There's like
oh no, I was just apologizing that I was having trouble unmuting, but I appreciated you reading my question.
So the question is, have people used eye tracking measures to assess analogical reasoning earlier than the age range used here, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, but not. I think the thing that I came up against, and one of the reasons we were considering 4 years rather than younger, is that a lot of times previous work has used, someone correct me if I'm wrong, different types of analogy tasks for children, infants 2-3 versus older. That's why I added, I would have to really adapt this task to make it something that a little 3-year-old can sit through and manage and solve. You would have to change some of the verbiage and the actual task, so it's something they can tackle. In terms of eye tracking, it tends to be sort of same different comparisons and sort of just like preferential looking rather than actual using like areas of interest and these kinds of proportion looking measures. So there has been eye tracking used, but in just a slightly different way with different tasks.
Thanks.
If that answers your question. I think you're muted, Matthew.
should know that by now, shouldn't I? Is it okay to remove your slides? Or unless you'd like to keep them up, of course, yeah. Nina Sims has got a question. Would you like to ask? Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. So I have questions. They're not, I guess, so specifically about the studies you presented exactly, but just generally thinking about, I had sort of two potentially related thoughts about applying this to education. So it seems like one thing that gesture is really good at, of course, as you pointed out, is drawing kids' attention to what they need to be paying attention to right then. And so two thoughts about that is, one, that allows them to make that alignment, which is necessary for them to, like, say, reveal what's in common about something if they're comparing two math problems or something. But I'm curious if you have thought about what that does for their ability to sort of move on after that once those cues are not being provided. So for instance, in looking at those scene analogies, there's other information in there. And as a student, if, say, those scene analogies were like math problems and what they need to do is really figure out what's important and what's not, or maybe those sort of core pieces are helping them distinguish what solution for a different math problem would be helpful. It seems like there could sometimes be a cost to gesture really controlling attention in this way, that kids are not going to attend to other information that might be useful in other ways. And conversely, or not conversely, but just in addition, not sort of like learning, like when do you take the training wheels off so that they can learn to hone in on the information that's relevant for themselves? And that was a little bit messy, but sort of thoughts about bigger picture stuff for using this for education.
Yeah, that's a great question. Great thoughts. So I think it can go both ways. I think a lot of research has suggested that gesture is actually really useful for generalizing learning. So say you learn, a particular, I don't know if these scene analogies are the right example, but say math problem like you brought up, and they use gesture to help them figure out kind of what the equal signs means or something like that, then it can actually be really beneficial for generalizing that to new problem formats. And there's plenty of work out there showing that. But I do think you bring up a great point, is that it can almost narrow in their attention too much in a way. So say in this problem, right, if we're directing attention to the relation, the things that are involved in chasing, say, then we're not giving them a chance to explore that featural match. And so I think that's one thing that can certainly, and we have previous work on this as well. I hinted at it when I mentioned the sort of project that's part of a bigger study that had the eye tracking and all the different factors. That is part of a larger study that is out there now if you wanted to explore it. But it does get into this sort of like double-edged sword of gesture, where it's great because it does direct their attention, but when you take that gesture away, they are suddenly like, oh, well, there's this like other tiger. What do I do with that? And so it can sort of narrow in their attention too much. I think that answers like part of your thought process there. And then the other part being kind of, when do you take away gesture? And I think that can sort of happen organically in a classroom setting, but I do think this study here is saying that, past a certain age point, it doesn't even really matter if you're using that gesture or not. And of course, that depends on the domain. This is just these particular scene analogy problems with analogical reasoning. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it wasn't really a question so much as
it was like a thought I wanted to add to it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think that's really helpful because, again, thinking about education, that it's not as simple as just saying like point when you're doing a comparison, right? Because there's more things to think about than that for instructors. But yeah, this was really interesting. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
We have a question from Ariel Starr. Ariel, would you like to ask a question?
Thanks. And thanks, Katharine, for that really neat talk. And I'm so impressed you're able to collect so much usable eye tracking data in a museum. Really.
It was a thing.
Yeah, out there doing the work. So one thing that stood out to me is that it seemed like you were maybe bearing the lead a little bit, and that it just seemed like overall the effect of the intervention was incredibly effective at boosting kids' analogical reasoning skills. I think you showed a graph that was pre-test, and even the 11-year-olds were around like 33% or 35%. And I guess there's a lot of items in the scene, so I'm not sure how exactly you'd calculate chance, but that seems pretty low for kids of that age. But then after the instructions, either gesture or speech, most of the age groups were like around 70-ish%. So I guess the question that I have is there something about the original instructions that is maybe a little bit impoverished compared to how the scene analogy task has been described in the literature elsewhere, that even older kids were doing kind of so poorly? Or is there, I guess, could you talk a little bit more about what was in your instructions compared to how this task has been used previously, just because the performance boost was so great?
Yeah, so to your first sort of piece of that is, yes, they were all pretty terrible at the trial at pretest. And I think in terms of bearing the lead, I think it's definitely exciting that they can learn in this short intervention from either kind of instruction, speaking to the older children. So I think that's very important. I think, yeah, that is something I could emphasize more, because that's cool, right? That's exciting. But I definitely was sort of focused on this between conditions difference. So thank you for pointing that out. To the other point of how this relates to previous analogical reasoning research that's used scene analogies or anything similar. So Richland and colleagues 2006 is one thing that this was definitely very much built from, the task itself. We sort of adapted it. They used a lot of different kinds of relations, whereas here we only use chasing, so sort of simplify things for different reasons. And so their instruction was pretty similar. It was very similar in a lot of ways in terms of saying like which thing is in the same part of the pattern, in terms of the prompt. I think what's different here, and I haven't seen other work, but please let me know if there's something out there, I'd love to know, that provides instruction on scene analogies. So I think we were kind of creating that instruction ourselves. There was previous work that definitely prompted us in terms of how we wanted to relate the two scenes, and so definitely highlight that relation. The prompt at pre and post was something that was definitely inspired by previous work and very much aligned with it. But I hadn't seen anything that was actually trying to train scene analogies. So I think we kind of just came up with what made sense to us. And we did go through a few iterations, many pilots originally. This is the second study where we've used this instruction. So we had known from the previous work that it works to some extent, kids get it. So that was nice to know. But I hope that answers your question. But there really wasn't anything for us to compare it to. So
congratulations on coming up with such an effective intervention.
Yeah, cool. That's exciting. So.
I'll also just say, I wonder if some of it is testing in a museum, like, and that would be a curious thing, right? Like, in so many of the lab studies or like a classroom study, you have the kid at a place where you're like, you're now going to learn. And so instead we're pulling kids off the museum floor. So I wonder if that has anything to do with it. You know, Katie and I haven't talked too much about that, but I was just like, oh yeah, like that could be something that played a role too.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is definitely what inspired the short intervention of just a couple trials, because we wanted to keep the whole thing within like 5 minutes for, practical purposes. And yeah, I mean, the kids are all over the place in the museum, so it's very, very noisy and messy, and so it was nice that I could teach them something. So yeah.
Do you need to go, Katie, or are you happy to take any more questions? Or?
I'm okay for like a couple more minutes, and then
okay, yeah. So if anyone's got any other questions, if anyone would like to ask questions to Orion as well, please do. So we've got a question from it's Jane. Jane, do you want to ask that yourself, or?
Yeah, okay. My name's Jane. I was silhouetted in the dark. Sorry about that. I'm new to the group, and I'm interested in what you do. I'm from a computer science education background, and I'm wondering if you're aware of any research that kind of blends the two, because obviously programming, it's all about comparing a bit of code to another bit of code, and our students, particularly our younger, well, in fact, I'm going to say particularly our younger students, even our degree level students, have lots of problems in figuring out what is the important difference and what to attend to. So I just wondered, first of all, do you know of any research that is blending the two?
I would love someone else to speak up if they know of something. That is, I have not personally come across anything like that. That's certainly relevant. I think builds off of all of these skills we've been talking about. I'm sorry, I don't know.
And then I've got a follow-up question, which is, you know, you're saying about it's the sweet spot seem to be at the 5-year-olds. With programming, that's it, when we show children or young people, whatever age, you know, this new programming language, it's the first time they've ever seen it. Do you suspect there might be a similar sweet spot where whilst they're kind of, sorry, that's my cat, whilst they're kind of becoming familiar with the context, that the kind of the pointing bit, the gesture might have a similar kind of magical effect? Again, I don't know if that's a silly question.
No, I don't think that's silly. I think certainly, I think because it's not just in this study, other studies as well in other domains, whether it's math or in things like that, that have shown that yes, like there's sort of a particular point where gesture might be helpful, but they still don't really get it. But then when you move on in development, now they have some kind of, I don't know what the right analogy is in coding, but I do think there's probably, they need some kind of foundational knowledge to even be able to say, okay, well, what is she pointing at? Why is that important? Whereas maybe when you get past that, maybe the gesture doesn't matter so much, or you get to something more complicated. And then again, the gesture might be really useful to orient them again to a more complex.
Cool. We call that mental models. So we talk about children developing mental models for certain programming constructs. So maybe that's where once they've got that, then you don't need to point anymore. But anyway, I just want to say it was really, really interesting, and I'm very excited to be kind of learning from you all.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks for coming along, Jane. You're actually in luck because I emailed this entire group asking if there's any research on analogies and conversation very recently. And there isn't a lot, unfortunately. So it's good you're here. Yeah, if anyone else got any questions to ask at all? Something I was going to ask, Katharine, is, you know, in the gestures, were they always, sorry if I've missed this, but were they always pointing at the objects rather than kind of describe, like highlighting the relations? Like, could that have an effect? Or
yeah, so it was both. So it was as the individual things were being sort of spoken about or described the first time, they would be pointing to them. But then this relation, they would show chasing, and then they would also make the relations across the two scenes. So it would be with two different hands. There's not like a good way to do that on that scene, on the way it's laid out. But we did try to utilize something that's sort of a step beyond just pointing, but trying to really represent those relations with the gestures. So I think you could, of course, vary the gesture in a million different ways and see if there's a better way to represent relations or a less way. I don't know why you wouldn't go that direction, but I'm sure there are different ways. We have played with, and we have the data, and I don't know if we're ever going to do anything with it, Liz, but we do have the data where we specifically highlight the distractor, and we sort of like, rather than this sort of double-edged sword I was talking about, where maybe they never actually look at the distractor, so then later it trips them up, where we actually during instructions say, oh, well, there's this other boy, but don't pay attention to him, he's not in the pattern. I don't have anything to say about that data right now because we haven't done anything about it, but I think there's plenty of places you can sort of vary how you're delivering that instruction.
Thank you. Cheers. Any other questions, or should we?